in the webinar software in the toolbar. I've added a screenshot of the toolbar here. You'll see how questions will be displayed and how answers will appear. Note that I recorded this image on a Mac, so your interface may look slightly different, but the function and layout should be more or less the same. Your questions can be technical if you're experiencing problems with the software, or content questions about what is being discussed. If you prefer, you may also email my coworker Kayla Mallon, whose email address is mallonk@si.edu. That's MALLONK@si.edu. We really would like a high level of participant involvement with this webinar, so please do ask questions as they come to you. We'll also have a couple polls throughout, so we'd appreciate your feedback on those as well. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Gwen Warniment. Gwen works for the Los Alamos National Laboratory Foundation as their Director of Professional Development and Evaluation. In particular science education, she helps coordinate a inquiry science education consortium that involves large-scale professional development, summer institutes, strategic planning, and collaboration with several school districts, superintendents, principals, and community members. In addition, she organizes and delivers training in advanced content and pedagogy for lead teachers and science literacy coaches. Gwen is a doctoral candidate in curriculum and instruction at New Mexico State University. She has led workshops in professional development involving both science and language arts for various school districts, the New Mexico State Public Education Department, as well as at national conferences. So without further ado, Gwen, please take it away.
Can you hear me, Kyle? Hi, can you hear me? All right. So my name is Gwen Warniment again, and I live and work in northern New Mexico, and I'm actually from northern New Mexico, which is really wonderful. I like to support the community that I come from. Just to give you a little bit of a background or context of that, northern New Mexico is very rural and expansive, so the school districts that I work with range from tiny, where there's 110 schools, 110 students, K-12, to some larger school districts working with, even Rio Rancho with the Laser I3 project that the Lano Foundation funds in tandem. So to give you just kind of a framework for this webinar, there's kind of three components that I organized it around. The first is this idea of pedagogy, and I really want to emphasize that and start with that because I think you can't speak to or around notebooks without backtracking and actually kind of having this foundation of what exactly is happening in the classroom with inquiry science. So we're going to speak a little bit around pedagogy, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the logistics of science notebooks and the form and function that occurs with them. And then the third thing that we're going to do is look at Common Core state standards, and I realize that the Common Core isn't across the board in every state, but there are some particular shifts that I think even impact, say, for instance, Texas. So kind of maybe if we don't look at them as Common Core, but how are we increasing rigor, particularly in English language arts, and how does that connect with science? So without further ado, we go to the next slide. So Kyle, do I have control of the slides, or do you? Let's see.
You do.
Okay, because I don't think it's moving.
You can either click on the slide or use your arrow keys, I believe.
Yeah, I'm trying both. Oh, there we go. Okay. So before we get started, actually, if we can run the first poll, that's going to give us a general idea of how much time we can spend on one of those three different topics or components. So can we go to the poll? And, okay. was going to ask this very first question, which is how comfortable you feel with science notebooks, because I think that's going to impact how much time we spend on either looking at pedagogy and or the logistics around science notebooks and the range and the form of, and function that they serve, and then these connections with English language arts standards. So if you can select one of the following: I'm either an expert and even use them to guide instruction. I'm comfortable fully integrating them. I use them during science but feel they're somewhat superficial. I use them periodically, or I've not used them at all. Please submit.
We'll give it a few more seconds and then close the poll, and we'll all see the results.
Great. Great. Okay. That's wonderful. So I'm going to quickly go through kind of the first two parts of this webinar that talks about the form and function. If at any point you have a question, please send it to Kyle and Kayla, so that because there are some spaces built into the webinar where I'm going to field some questions. So if I'm going quickly, feel free to ask and say, can you backtrack and talk more about around this topic? So this first slide is kind of a framework for how we look at inquiry instruction, right? So there's this, I think I'm going to focus right in the center where there's the ellipses, oval shapes, and then there's a box. So this idea of engagement in the lesson, beginning a lesson, establishing those learning goals, focusing, this idea of a focus question or essential question. If we think of inquiry instruction, we know that that's the first component. And the second is this idea of the intellectual activity. So we have this, hands-on component, this exploration. So when we say hands-on science, that's typically, evocative of that particular component inside of an entire lesson. The third component, and I have it in a box for a reason, because I feel like it's somewhat nebulous and not really spoken about to the depth that it needs to be spoken about. It's this idea of reasoning, and it involves analysis and reflection on what just happened. So it connects with the activity, the exploration, and it connects with the learning goal or the focus question. But it's kind of this thing, this idea of sense making. So I use the term sense making, but there are a lot of terms out there that mean the same thing. So reasoning, meaning making, or making meaning. So I'm going to consistently use the term sense making throughout the duration of the webinar, because in effect the notebooks are going to be represented at each of these stages. So we have that idea of sense making and the discussion that occurs with that. And then the fourth component in the inquiry lesson is this idea of drawing conclusions and being able to apply what was learned. So I make a clear distinction between this idea of analysis and reasoning and the ability to draw conclusions. For a long time, I think it's pretty established now, but for a long time, that box was missing. And what happened is we were establishing a learning goal for students. There was a hands-on component, and then we would say, okay, let's draw some conclusions. And the meaty work, this really important, thick, rich part of actually making sense of what just happened, taking the time to analyze and go through this kind of discussion and reflection on what has happened is necessary for students, for all of us really, to be able to draw some conclusions and or write explanations, which is what the next generation science standards are now calling for. So on the side of that middle column, you have some of the traditional aspects that you have that are found in science notebooks, like a question, maybe some predictions, maybe some planning, maybe data collection, Notice on this side I have graphs, data, and analysis, and I'm moving my mouse there to kind of point it out. Graphs are another step after data collection. They really involve much more of a secondary level of analysis. So the data collection occurs in tandem with the activity, but then you have the graphs. You have sometimes you have claims and evidence inside of a notebook, and then you kind of revisit. So these pieces are not necessarily the lesson itself. The lesson is the middle part. Those are pieces in tandem with the lesson. So kind of want to just point that out that way, because when you look at those pieces, that's kind of how we traditionally, or in an old-fashioned way, looked at the scientific method. So moving away from that and kind of looking at it from more of a pedagogical or instructional lens, we see the actual frame of how we are teaching science in this way. Nope. Okay, great. So nope, I'm going to go back one. These are 3 goals of notebooks that I heavily rely on. And they're not, not just necessarily coming from me. I'm not pulling these out of my head. I'm looking at an entire body of work that exists out there for notebooks. I'm not the sole expert on notebooks by any means whatsoever. I'm relying on a lot of work out there. So these 3 are the ones that I hinge my work off of when I'm working with teachers in professional development. Notebooks are to be used as a tool through which students construct understanding of concepts. They're used to develop and exercise language skills, and importantly to replicate the work of scientists. Or even maybe replacing the word replicate, allow them to become scientists in their own right. So I use these goals because I think this is what really distinguishes or makes a notebook effective, and not necessarily just a representation of some tasks that were completed, but rather makes it something that is evocative of student thinking, makes student thinking visible, hence the title of this webinar. Okay, I think that another thing that I want to say about the goals of these notebooks is that the point about language skills is pretty important. Science is often not recognized as as a two-sided coin, and it really is, this two-sided coin of both investigation and communication. So science, you investigate phenomena, but you do so, and in addition, you communicate your understanding to the body at large. It's based on this idea of a community of practice. Okay, so I actually just have this slide just as a reference for everyone. It's this notebook that I borrowed from the Los Alamos National Laboratory on loan from the Biosciences Division. It's right there embedded on the front page of their notebook. So I just took a snapshot of it, but it shows all of your laboratory data recorded daily in your notebook. I like the bottom paragraph. Original entries made in the usual course of your work are the best record of your accomplishments. The notebook should be a complete source of information for future experiments, for the preparation of reports you may write. It may also be a deciding factor in litigation involving a question of inventorship or for a patent. So, really recognizing that these notebooks, even for students, are authentic. And finally, in reference to pedagogy, this is the wonderful work out of Stanford that overlaps, right? The Math Common Core standards, the English Language Arts standards, and then the science practices for the next generation science standards, and how integrated they really are. So maybe I'll be referring back to this as well. Okay, so these are my favorite books on science notebooking. Essentials of Science and Literacy is really wonderful. I See What You Mean is actually it's a book that's been around for a while, but I love that book. It's amazing. A lot of nuggets gold nuggets in that book by Steve Moline. That's the second edition version that I have represented up there. Betsy Fulweiler's book on writing in science is amazing, particularly because it really connects beautifully with English language arts. And as an elementary teacher, for those elementary teachers who are listening, she has great scaffolds available, and the videos in that book are wonderful. That's also, I think, a second edition that she has. And then finally, Science Notebooks, Writing About Inquiry by Lori Fulton and my wonderful friend Brian Campbell, who I think is in the audience. This is a must-read and my favorite by far out of all of those. So there's amazing other notebook or books on notebooking out there. So interactive notebooks, this idea of questions, claims, and evidence, or a book called What's Your Evidence that is really great too. But those are my favorites. So you can definitely find information about this out there. All right, we're on to the second part. So the second part of this webinar is really focused on the logistics, or the form and function. And so I'll quickly go through this because it seems like everyone's pretty comfortable with this. Flow of the notebook should match this idea of the flow of the inquiry cycle, establishing the learning goal, the data collection, thinking about my data, and the synthesis. Okay, so I might just kind of quickly flick through these slides because everyone seems to be pretty comfortable with this. Features, these are possible features, and it's really dependent on grade level, which is okay and great. So as I'm flicking through these slides, be thinking, what's really practical at my grade level? That's a very viable, important question for you, and we can have a discussion about that at the very end, because I'm going to try and cushion in a good at least 10 minutes for richer discussion. So I've got a resource pocket at the very front where students have, scaffolded questions for them to use or rubrics. I have a title page. Students do that. Oh, let me go back. Lets them kind of own their book. I think that's really important. There's a table of contents. We've got page numbers, titles of lessons. But importantly, no date, because they're going to put the date on the page. There's other ideas. But notice that I have these idea of the elements of the notebook, and so I'm distinguishing this concept of what exactly are elements inside of the notebook as opposed to these features. So features are more structural. Are they really, necessary? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. Also, again, depending on the grade level. What do you need in there, and how much time do you have in the science lesson to focus on those things? So going back to kind of this idea of the flow of the notebook so that we can kind of move on to the elements. Here we have, I want to focus on 4 components. Let me go back so you can see that they kind of match. There's learning goal, data collection, thinking about my data, and synthesis. There's the learning goal, data collection, thinking about my data, and synthesis. Okay, so notice that I want to really focus on 3 of these things. So when I have thinking about my data, that's a really kind of me and, like I said before, kind of nebulous place inside of the lesson. The learning goal is really pretty easy and established, and actually should go really quickly inside of a lesson. So often when I'm doing professional development with teachers, I ask them, how much time are you spending on the focus question, on setting up the investigation? It should be no more than 7 minutes, really. So we'll go in, do some observations of the classroom and say, okay, so I'm noticing that the focus is taking a long time, the engagement part. But these are components of the notebook that actually go in there. Maybe setting a purpose, perhaps a focus question, perhaps a prediction, perhaps materials and plan. Data collection I'm going to speak more to because that's a really rich aspect in and of itself. Could do a whole professional development on just data collection in addition to thinking about my data. And then this idea of synthesis. I had in red 3 in particular, so I didn't have the thinking about my data in red, so I'm sorry, I don't know why it is. But I had put the learning goal in red, data collection in red, and synthesis in red. And the reason that I wanted to highlight those three things is because if you're just starting with science notebooks, those are the three things that you really highlight in on as a teacher. Those are the three things that are going to allow students to take this to a level of independence. You want to move, the purpose of this webinar and kind of working with notebooks and kind of having this, step back and reflect on how we are using notebooks in the science classroom is to move away from a mechanical use of notebooks and a mechanical use of science or science kits for that matter to more of an insightful use. We're facilitating student independence with this as a tool. So we want to offer explicit opportunities for kids to engage in science, but we have to plan for these opportunities strategically. And in planning for this, those three components of the lesson, establishing the learning goal, providing data for a forum for data collection and synthesis, are the most important areas to strategically focus on in order to do this. That being said, let's take some time to focus on those three things. So I have some examples here. This is from a 6th grade, actually. So, and I'm purposely using it. It's kind of messy for a 6th grade, but it's coming from a student, I think, who, well, I don't need to say anything else. But this is a 6th grade example. What happens when they're planning. It looks like they have their focus question up there, but it's not even identified. It's kind of messy. It just says, what is the salt tolerance of our plants? And then it says controlled factor, add soil to cup, add seeds, add water. There's a prediction there. I predict that 1 scoop of salt will grow soonest. So it looks like they're doing some sort of experiment that involves salt water, right, with plant growth. Let's see. Another representation of before the investigation. This is from 4th grade. My questions. What will they eat? Will they lay eggs? Will the crayfish kill another? Why do they keep losing eggs? Then I have this representation of what something looks like during the investigation. So again, think back to that idea of what I had said with establishing that learning goal and what that looked like before the investigation, matching those images of before the investigation, and what this is this idea of the data collection, the meat part of the investigation. So here we have 2 representations, and then let me go back to after the investigation. And I really like this slide because it's kind of contrasts really nice the idea of something at maybe a 4th or 5th grade level with, or even a 3rd grade level with 1st grade. Okay, so this next image is what looking kind of honing in on those elements as opposed to general images of science notebooks from students. Focus question. So I apologize if I'm going through this too quickly. So again, please keep track of your, send in your questions. But because so many people said they're comfortable with this, I'm going to go quickly. So focus question. These are types of data. So data collection is huge. It's just an enormous field in and of itself because there's charts, there's drawings, there's labels, there's text, narrative, questions. It's a pretty heavy-duty field in and of itself. This is a student collecting data, and I like this image because you have a contrast of 2 students. You can't see the one in the red too well, but they are collecting data in 2 very different ways, but still involved in the same exact investigation. This is a 5th grade notebook. How can you, looking at the, I think they were, yeah, the vinegar eels, exactly. Okay. And then this slide I chose to kind of represent the idea that many of the science kits that we work with, if you do work with science kits, come with blackline masters, and that's okay and wonderful in many ways, and they provide an excellent scaffold, so it's okay and to use them. In fact, the science notebook that I took examples from the lab had printouts that they had pasted into their notebook. So, you know, notebooks are messy and students own them. But you also want to be aware of, are you just using the collection of blackline masters, and do they become, or they have this, you know, they could have a tendency to just become a record of worksheets. So in what way are you using them so that they are making student thinking visible? We're keeping that at the back of our head. And so then we have this idea of the wrap-up of the lesson and the conclusion. And this slide I liked and chose because it has two things. The student wrote a conclusion and a reflection, which is amazing and kind of gets at the idea of semantics. There's a thermometer. The thermometer does act differently when placed in the sun and the shade, because when in the sun, the warmer it gets, etc. Reflection, I wonder if. So, you know, when we think of synthesis as an element inside of the lesson, what goes into synthesis in and of itself, and what does synthetic writing look like? You know, what is a summary? So we've got summary, synthesis, conclusion, reflection, all of these wonderful words, and how are we really, what do we want to get at that ending component? That really depends on the grade level. What you do want to do is connect it back to the learning goal. So whatever the learning goal was, the focus question, whatever, you want that the most important part of this ending summary or synthesis of the lesson is to get back to that, so that students can come back and kind of make sense and reflect. Okay, I really do know, or I can construct an explanation of what just happened, of this experience. So all of these other aspects, the reflection, are really wonderful and can be built in or can be a mini lesson in and of themselves, but I really want to emphasize that the aspect of getting back to the learning goal. All right. Finally, we're going to speak a little bit about assessment. So I'm going to reiterate the goals of the science notebook at this point. We wanted to make sure that students use these notebooks as a tool through which they are able to construct understanding of concepts, that they are able to develop and exercise language skills, and that they replicate or engage as scientists in and of themselves. And so are the notebooks serving as a tool? Do they have the form and function to do that? I think that's the most important point to come to when we're speaking around assessment, and I think it's critical, and we can't talk about notebooks and what they do without speaking towards assessment. Are these notebooks really showing what kids can do, what science practices they're able to engage in, what content they understand, or are they just a representation of them following directions or the ability to complete a task that they were told to do? I think that's a really important question for teachers to ask themselves. What are the notebooks showing? Are they showing this teacher work, or are they showing the student work? Are they showing the teacher thinking, or are they showing the student thinking? That being said, assessment with notebooks needs to be quick, feasible. You want to look at the components. You want to look at the meaning inside of it versus the particular components. You want to actually look at those explanations, that synthetic writing. And then following that, you want to ask yourself, well, what are you going to do once you do know this, what the students know or don't know? So there are, a variety of ways out there. You can Google a bunch of rubrics. There's a ton of images of student notebooks on Pinterest, but I want you to be critical of those, because are they collections of foldables or are they really a tool that is authentically able to buoy student thinking and independence and learning, and are they functioning as a science tool? So, you know, you can do the idea of 2 stars and a wish, where you're providing feedback and you just write 2 stars that you loved about the notebook, and a wish was something you want them to focus on. The idea of the line of learning many people have learned, you know, after you share out, or revision with color many people know as well. If you don't, ask the question and I'll talk more about it. Think alouds, though. That's one I do want to emphasize here. One thing that teachers and students can do to help support each other. So assessment builds classroom culture. It's like one of the best things to build classroom culture. Almost better than simply collaboration involved in hands-on engagement. In the sense-making part of the lesson, and after, having students share their writing, share their thinking in a safe environment, and the teacher sharing hers is, you know, very powerful. All right, so I'm going to actually pause right here on this slide. The kiddo is looking at the frogs, and take some questions before we go into the third part. Kyle or Kayla, are you going to be fielding the questions, or can I just pick?
Well, we have one question here. One person asks if you could explain your statement to look critically at assessment tools on Pinterest, specifically with your statement about, is it just a collection of foldables? Is that another term for like Blackline Masters?
Oh, sure, no problem. Okay, thanks. Okay, so when you Google science notebooks, you're going to get a lot of wonderful, wonderful images and you know, information about them. But you will also get images of science notebooks that look great, but maybe are superficial in really the function that they serve. So notice that the images inside of notebooks that I'm showing you are pretty messy, and they are students making sense of their own engagement with the science, their own investigation. So in fact, this slide that I have up there, the kids are testing out the light with the frogs. Notice these 2 kids in the front, the one with the blue folder, the one with the black folder, and how different their notebooks are. One is sparse and the other one has a little bit more. I'm not looking for a foldable that's a pre-produced document where they're folding in and they're labeling parts of the frog, right? And I'm not saying that that's necessarily bad. However, I am saying that if the kids are doing an investigation, testing light and how frogs react to the light, how are they developing more advanced, much more advanced science practice skills? How are they analyzing and interpreting data, planning and carrying out the investigation? How are they asking questions and defining problems? How are they able to construct explanations? How are they obtaining, evaluating, communicating information? Inside of that, and then I'm pulling from all these science practices from the next generation science standards. How are they doing that at a much more advanced level than merely, you know, a foldable that, you know, lists vocabulary, for instance? So.
Okay. We have a couple other good questions here, but maybe in the interest of making sure we get through all of your content, we wait to cover them at the end.
Sure, sounds great. Okay. So this last part is actually kind of the thickest part of the webinar. And I'm going to speak around connections with the English language arts. Standards with Common Core, but if you don't have Common Core, if there's people from Houston, you know, keep this in mind as far as how is this relating to the Texas English language arts standards. And then also bring to the table the distinctions for the rest of the group, please, you know, in some of your discussion and or questions. So I'm starting with this slide because I think it's really powerful and it's going to set the foundation for how I speak around connections with Common Core or English Language Arts standards. This is Jay Lemke's work, and he speaks about the language or languages of science. So I really want us to think about science language or science discourse as becoming pretty complex. And it's not becoming, it is very complex. We are transitioning into a multiliterate society given our technology, and this is an excellent point that connects science with our multiliteracy. So science is represented not only by words, so when we think of language we usually think of text as simply words, but it's also represented by images, right? We all know that, particularly elementary teachers. Visuals are huge. However, science is also very much represented in actions and in symbols, with mathematics symbols in particular. So it's important to remember that when we talk about English language arts standards, language arts standards, how are we expanding this notion of literacy? And how do notebooks in science buoy this idea or this expansion of literacy? So how are students communicating their findings? If the notebooks serve as a tool through which they communicate their findings of their investigation, of their experience, their observations, whatever is happening, how are they doing this in a multidimensional form? Because science calls for that. So the next slide is pretty quick. I'm going to speak just around, it kind of sets up what I'm going to talk about in connection with this idea. It's not going though. There we go. These are 5 instructional shifts that the Common Core calls for. We're all familiar with them. Calls for an emphasis on informational text, calls for much more robust text complexity, calls for evidential response, argumentative writing, some sort of evidence, right? It calls for much richer academic vocabulary and emphasis on academic vocabulary and authentic discourse. So these are the 5 that I really target. There's other shifts, but I find these to be very important. So I'm going to connect them to the notebooks because so the first thing is this idea of visual literacy and how visual literacy actually connects with informational text. So when we think of informational text, we typically think of nonfiction, right? But I want to highlight visual literacy because it's a critical component in science. And it's going to become critical in everything with our given technology. So the definition of visual literacy that I find I love the most is from Vasquez, Comer, and Troutman. They published a book on visual literacy, I think, in 2010. It's the ability to read and interpret a visual image, but it's also the ability to communicate information using visual representations. So not just be able to read, and typically we just focus on the idea of being able to read and know what that image means, but how are you establishing your own image and communicating an idea through that image? So I chose that image of the solar system because I think unless we unpack that particular image, there are misconceptions involved with it. So if I presented that and I said, okay, so what is that? What are some misconceptions or ideas that is showing that are actually wrong? You know, I think that's important because we don't necessarily do that. I'm going to speak a little bit about predictions. I don't encourage predictions at every single lesson. I think it's actually a disservice to kids and teachers alike. Predictions should only be there if there's sufficient background knowledge. You know, predictions shouldn't take, if a kid is not able to make a prediction in 30 seconds, then it's not really a prediction, right? Then it should, unless it's involved doing background research and then forming a hypothesis around that. But I chose this slide because there are images involved with establishing a prediction. So this is sound, I think the pitch gets lower as the air column gets longer, and noting and showing with images this idea of what they think is happening. So I also want to reiterate that this idea of informational text and visual literacy is occurring across the spectrum of the science notebook, meaning across the span of the lesson, both at the beginning, perhaps even involved with the learning goal of the focus question, the prediction, definitely the data collection, and definitely in the synthesis, drawing involved with making meaning or establishing an explanation. I'll speak quickly to the types of diagrams that are out there. I think it's important for teachers to understand this, particularly when we call for students to write and draw diagrams. These are two types of diagrams. The first one is an analytic, where you have the class 1, class 2, class 3 lever because it's pieces of the whole. It's talking about parts. And the second kind is a synthetic diagram, where you're talking about the entire whole, the parts of the whole. It's it represents chains or cyclical notions. It's a web diagram or cycles. It's an overarching concept. Being able to kind of really truly understand those is important for what you're asking from students. This idea of scientific drawing, of course, is imperative, huge. Most of us are really familiar with this. I love the term ABCD. I particularly use that, encourage all of the teachers that I work with to create a poster. ABCD, meaning all of your scientific drawings should be accurate, big, complete, and detailed. Some teachers write colorful. I actually shy away from the term colorful. I think color can be a detriment. It's necessary sometimes, but not always. I prefer the term complete. And then labeled as well, So I think most of us are familiar with scientific drawing and how important it is. So I'm going to move on. There's examples, 4th grade classroom and a kindergarten grade classroom of how the integration of informational text, visual literacy in informational text is it's part and parcel. Okay, so I'm going to speak around the second one. This second shift, text complexity, I'm going to focus, instead of lexile level, I'm going to take an entirely different approach to this, because I think in science we tend to forget that complex texts, we obviously are all focused on lexile level, but the connection with notebooks is in this idea of how we read and create graphs and charts. Charts and graphs are increasingly complex. So I have an example, again, from that science notebook from the lab, from the Los Alamos National Lab, that, we have no idea what this means. I asked, actually, the scientist and said, okay, give me an idea of what this means if I'm going to present it. This is an incredibly complex text with minimal text. So I don't even know if we ran a lexile test on it, what it would come up with. Probably pretty high, because you've got words like cytometry in there, fluorescence measurement, right? But modulated. But at the same time, what's so complex about it is not even just the academic vocabulary, but the actual structure of the graph itself. This is another example I pulled from the web. That's more of a sporting goods advertisement, so it's not even from science, but it's definitely an application of engineering, and so it's an example of complex text. That's from Everyday, and I make the connection with the notebooks because when students are collecting data, when they are able to compose charts, tables, graphs, they are much more apt to be able to understand and read them. It's, many special ed teachers know this. When students actually create them themselves, or when you begin with writing, the effect on the reading is incredible. It's really powerful. We tend to focus on reading first and then writing, but actually the reverse is really impactful. And there's a lot of studies out there that affect early childhood with beginning students or young kids with writing instead of reading. So this idea of, authentic, meaningful data that students are taking from the investigation, that they're doing it themselves. So they're not just replicating the teacher work or the collective, but they themselves are having to make sense of it, is really important. But so too is kind of this language lens that I'm taking in how we understand data collection. That being said, again, think about this at your particular grade level. So this looks like a 6th grade level. What am I thinking about in kindergarten? How am I representing data at kindergarten? And perhaps it is collective work, right? So keep in mind, those are very important questions. I want you to really kind of keep yourself grounded at what is practical and what's the range. Because I think instead of saying that this is only applicable at kindergarten, what's a good range for kindergarten? Or what do I know is applicable for early childhood through maybe 2nd grade? Because I think that don't limit yourself as well. Okay. Image of someone collecting data. I'm going to go quickly through this. This is a kindergarten kid collecting data. So what are the scaffolds you're setting up at your particular grade level? And this is a 6th grade example. So again, there's a black line master, but serves its purpose. And or how are you removing that scaffold and having students create their own? And a 4th grade example. Okay, so evidential response. This shift is huge, probably the most important if we're going to scale them, because it's at the nexus of the Venn diagram that I showed, the work from Stanford. Evidence and argument, right? Being able to establish a claim supported by evidence, whether it's evidence from the text, evidence from the investigation, evidence from your mathematical solution, all of it is there across every single standard. So it's just incredibly, it's just gigantic. This word, image that I have, I'm having trouble thinking about the name for where I pulled that from, Wordle. This Wordle that I developed, I actually inserted the words from the Common Core English Language Arts Standard, all of them. I copied and pasted the entire English Language Arts Standard inside of the Wordle and clicked run, and this is what came up. Students use evidence as the most common words in the entire English Language Arts Standard. And we all know that. I mean, the huge close reading movement, right? So another thing that kind of supports this idea of claims and evidence and argument, evidential response, is this document, Effective Science Instruction, What Does Research Tell Us? That kind of summarizes the entire, what we know is good inquiry instruction. And it outlines 5 things. So it's having some sort of motivation for kids' prior knowledge, that there's a purposeful intellectual engagement, in other words, something hands-on, or an investigation. And then the last 2 are interesting. They use evidence to critique others' claims, and they sense make, or they're making sense of that data. So it's kind of this, those 2 things work in tandem to be able to establish an explanation and or argue around that explanation. So this is a claims, evidence, and reasoning framework. I'm going to reference Zembel-Saul's book here, but not speak too much around it, because if you have questions, you can. This is an entire professional development in and of itself of doing claims, evidence, and reasoning. So Zembel-Saul, McNeil, Hirschberger have a wonderful book out there. That 2 books, one that's focused, I think, on K2 and one on 3.5 or something like that. It's called What's Your Evidence? But particularly this idea of being able to, the flow chart that I have there is across grade levels, and also across what you're doing as you're engaging in this activity. So being able to orally, in discussion, kind of formulate a claim and provide some evidence. So this is what we found. I know that this, it is what creates a complete circuit because the light bulb went on, and then being able to write to that, and then the ability to actually read and or pull from someone else's notebook to buoy or to strengthen their argument or their explanation. So what does it look like? Again, this is hard and thick, and questions may occur with this. Across the grade level, it really varies because this is a difficult component. But inside notebooks, I found that I really like the T-chart because there's sentence statements that really distinguish or help students differentiate between what exactly is a claim and what is evidence. But oral statements at younger grade levels developed by the entire class are really pretty appropriate as well. So got some first grade students discussing their findings from a science investigation involving balance and equilibrium. I think balance and motion is the kit. And so notice that he has a piece of paper in his hand and he's got some key words. So there's a connection there between being able to orally defend and then being able to write and or insert into the notebook. And so I'm going back to that idea of how are we providing a platform for student independence. And this notebook, this activity is making student thinking visible. It's them doing this. I'm going to skip this. This is a scientist notebook with an authentic claim and evidence, but it's pretty hard to read. Academic vocabulary. So yeah, this is from a 5th grade kit, right? This is Microworlds. Or I don't know, it's not necessarily 5th grade. It's 5th grade in the project that I work with ISEC. So expansive different grade levels. Hand lens, magnifier, focus, transparent. I just want you to reflect on these words and kind of think about how many of these words have more than one meaning. For instance, stage, body, knob, right? Focus even. So those words that have more than one meaning are always considered Tier 2 high utility academic vocabulary. So Isabel Beck, Marmot Cohen's work, the tiers of the vocabulary is incredibly important here. One of the best things that I have found in working with teachers in professional development is having them go to the glossary as they're planning before, and I recognize this takes time and planning is always an issue, but this is really critical. If you can go to the glossary and just highlight or identify what are the Tier 2 words, you're at a much better place to help your English language learners. Because the Tier 2 words are the words that are going to give the ELL students the more difficulty, much more than the Tier 3 words, because the Tier 3 words are specialized. So just recognizing those. So if I went back and said, which of those are Tier 2? How do I know? What how am I going to be able to strategize to that? So I'm speaking around academic vocabulary because I want to connect it to the notebooks. Everything connects to the notebooks. How are we able to provide a platform for students to be able to communicate their findings? How are we making their, able to facilitate them making their thinking visible? So there's different ideas. They can do a glossary. They can create an appendix. This idea of the object wall or word bank in your classroom is critical and important, even if it's repetitive of the science notebook, because any and all vocabulary that allows them to write inside their notebook, particularly thinking about that synthesis part or the more formalized writing, is important. Okay, and I like this image of the real science notebook from the lab because at the very bottom there you've got some symbols involved in that, and that connects with my very first slide, with Jay Lemke's ideas, that there are symbols involved with this range, or languages of science are much more robust. It's much more developed than what we typically think of as text. Okay, authentic discourse, our last shift. So what does discourse or talk have to do with the notebook? So when students are able to speak to what they found, when they're able to critique others' ideas or agree with others, when they're able to discuss, this ability to engage with language is fundamental to them being able to actually write as well. So earlier I spoke about the idea of putting writing before reading, or looking at both writing and reading in tandem. I'm also going to do that with talk and writing, talk and reading, so integrated. So being able to think about this multidimensionally. So throughout the entire lesson, the notebook is really reflecting talk. Talk that occurs at the beginning, talk during the hands-on piece, talk during the analysis, talk even after and with the synthesis and the explanation or argument. I'm not going to speak too much to this, so if you have questions about this, I'll speak around this slide, but this is how to be strategic and what you're doing in the classroom to kind of facilitate discourse. So what is the format, and then what are talk moves that you're doing as a teacher. This slide, though, is pretty important because it connects this idea of talk with the notebooks. So that circle that those students in 4th grade are engaged in, what they're doing is after the hands-on piece, they come to the circle and they have a sense-making session. And they all have their notebooks open and they have their data, all of the data collection that was involved. This piece is the most beautiful, the most rich, amazing part of the science lesson. And only through this are students really able to independently, strongly form their own explanation and or move to this more advanced idea of argumentation. So being able to scaffold, set up that sense-making circle, and or use the science notebooks for that part. So in red, way back in that one slide where I had that, the notebooks have the learning goal, they have a data collection, and then they have a synthesis. But that thinking about my data part, they may not necessarily have that. But what they will have is this experience in the circle where they're thinking about the data in tandem with their notebooks. The notebooks are part and parcel of that. They refer to, they use them, they become completely interactive. So, the strategic discourse bolsters the rigor involved with the entire lesson. The students begin to take ownership of the science. One thing I want to refer to here is this document called the Talk Science Primer that was put out by Turk. If anyone is interested in that, it's a wonderful document. And my last slide. I want you to think about how you prioritize these things. So the goals in general that I have when working with teachers and professional development around notebooks is this idea of sense-making for students, being able to replicate the work of scientists, exactly what goes on in notebooks with communication and writing, and the idea of formative assessment, and then perhaps you want to prioritize some of those common core shifts for yourselves. Which of those would you want to start on? And I really stress that you start with only one, right? So it's a lot. This is professional development that could occur over, good 3 years if it was in, set in place and just working around all of those. And in your classroom, you can start a little bit at a time. I mean, even if it's just integrating that sense-making piece, that coming to the circle, using your notebook, and thinking about what does the kindergarten notebook look like so that works, so the sense-making piece works. Is there really a focus question, or is there just data collection for kindergarten? Are they just drawing, right? For students who can't write or who are struggling with writing, what does it look like? And how are they still able to engage with the entire flow of the notebook? Let's break for questions.
Thank you, Gwen. That was an excellent presentation. We are running maybe a couple minutes behind, so we don't have a lot of time for questions. But if you have questions after that great presentation, please do submit them through the question feature in the software. We had one great question earlier, and it was do you recommend applying more than one rubric when evaluating a student's notebook? For instance, like one rubric to address ELA, English Language Arts, and then a separate one for science content?
No, actually I don't, because you're going to confuse the student, and also because I'm going to go back to the goal of the notebook. The notebook is to make student thinking visible of science concepts, and the communication that is involved with that is towards that end. It's to communicate what they understand about the science phenomena and investigation. So I'm not going to be grading for grammar and or complete sentences. What I can do, and also this is a workable document for students. This is something that is messy for them, and if you saw, I don't know if you could see very easily, but inside of the real science notebook, it's messy. There's scribbles, and what you can do is take something out of the notebook, or a conclusion statement or something, and have the student rework on that towards more of a formal presentation. But the only rubric I would use is one that's really focused on how do you feel you're doing, and having your notebook keep track of what's going on for you in the investigation.
Great, thank you. And unfortunately, we're out of time for this webinar, so we'll need to wrap things up. Thank you to everyone for attending and participating. I also want to give a big thanks to Gwen for such a great presentation and sharing her passion and expertise with us. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.
And again, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available on our website. Our next I3 teacher webinar will be on practices that promote student questioning during inquiry science, and will take place on Tuesday evening, March 24th. Finally, when you exit this webinar, you'll be directed to a very short survey. We greatly appreciate your feedback, and you're taking a small amount of time to respond to those couple questions. If for some reason it does not pop up in your browser window when you exit the webinar, it will also be included in the follow-up email sent by GoToWebinar tomorrow evening. So if you'd please respond to that, we'd really appreciate it. And thank you again for attending, and to Gwen for that great presentation, and have a great evening.
Sure. Great. Thank you.